Welcome to the webinar from the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health at NeoMed. We are very happy and excited to have you all join. I know you didn't come here to listen to me talk, but I'm just going to take a minute or two before we hand it off to Dory Hutchinson. So first thing I just want to let you know is that this particular topic was really, we identified it as a need from you all. As well as the upcoming topic. So thank you all for letting us know through the survey that we sent out what topics you'd be interested in. We will continue to do our best to meet that need. And so we have Dory Hutchinson speaking today. Just a quick reminder, on April 10th, and we have no Boston University bias. We really don't, but it seems like we might because we have Sarah Lipson, who's also from Boston University. She's a researcher, does a number of different things, but one of the things she does is really look at what sort of empirical findings come from the Healthy Minds surveys that many of us complete. And she's a real expert on looking at the intersection of mental health and academic outcomes. And that was another topic you all were interested in. And then on May 22nd, we have Dr. Juanita Martin from Ohio, who's going to talk about sort of best practices for engaging African-American and Black students. So that will be May 22nd, and we'll send you all reminders about that. A few other things. On May 21st, we have our in-person conference in Columbus, and that will be at the Quest Conference Center. And the topic or the theme is raising student voices and participation. That's one of the things we're really trying to do is help students have a louder voice on campuses, as well as the programming that we provide. And we're gonna have a panel with different students who are gonna be talking on that. So that's coming up. And then lastly, from my end, I just wanna let you all know, especially as it relates to this topic, is that the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health is just one entity in the Department of Psychiatry at NeoMed. We also have the Best Practices in Schizophrenia Treatment, oftentimes known as the BEST Center. And they do a lot of work around supported employment and supported education for people diagnosed with schizophrenia spectrum disorders. So if you have any interest or would like to know more about that program, you could reach out to Jessica or I, and we will put you in touch with the right people. And they actually helped us with finding Dory for this presentation. And then secondly, we have the Criminal Justice Coordinating Center of Excellence. And they do a lot of the CIT training for different campuses across Ohio, which of course is the best practice for de-escalating people, oftentimes the mental health issue, to make sure that their needs are adequately met. So I'm gonna turn it over to Jessica for a moment. She has a couple of things to announce and then we'll move on.
All right, so good afternoon and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jessica Zavala and I also have a couple of quick announcements to share. First, I want to share that the webinar today will be recorded and we will also disseminate the PowerPoints after the presentation today. We are also in the process of creating a way to view the webinars at a later date. I know we've heard from a number of folks that they couldn't attend during this hour, so please be on the lookout for communications via our listserv for when that platform will be available. Also, in our efforts to evaluate this webinar, as well as future webinars for the program, we invite you to complete an anonymous survey. That survey actually will be emailed to you after the webinar today. And then finally, my apologies if you experience any technical issues with registration. We are working with the Zoom platform, which is our webinar host, to work out those kinks. So back to you, Russell. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So without further ado, I'm going to do an introduction for Dory Hutchinson. We're incredibly excited to have her, a real expert. She's worked at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation at Boston University for 35 years and is the Director of Services. Her college mental health programs include a semester-long program for students out on medical leave for psychiatric reasons, collegiate mental health coaching and peer academic coaching to assist students to thrive emotionally, socially, and academically in higher education. And as we were preparing for this, just had some really insightful conversations with her about some of the things that she's been doing to really create accommodations, but also think about it from a campus-wide perspective, sort of a macro perspective. It resides outside of Office of Accessibility and the Counseling Center. It really resides in across the campus to really do an adequate job with this. So, Dory, thank you so much again, and you can get started.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. And everyone hopefully can see this. So I'm delighted to be here to talk about supporting students with serious mental health conditions who are on your campuses to succeed academically with reasonable accommodations. I actually have a very nice connection to everything Ohio. I have so many family members, including my children, who have gone to school at Wittenberg and Denison and University of Cincinnati. And I've spent a lot of time in Ohio. And so I'm delighted to be able to join all of you today. So as Russell said, I am the Director of Services here at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation at BU. And we have worked in increasing numbers in the last 20 years with students who are on our campus and who are on other campuses around the country who live with serious mental health conditions. And we've worked not just around their academic well-being, but their social and their actual wellness, because those things do not, they cannot be separated in terms of how they function on our campuses. And we've done this through services. I'm the Director of Services, but my center is also a national center in research and training. So we've done a fair amount of research around these issues as well. So our goal of our services is to empower college students with skills and supports so they can succeed and have a satisfying experience in college so that they graduate with a credential. Okay, that's really important. We know from the research that so many college students with serious mental health conditions do not finish. So we see these efforts in our Office of Accessibility and Disability Services as efforts to prevent lifelong disabilities. And when we help students to succeed, then we can change the trajectory, away from a lifetime of unemployment and underemployment. So my goal today with all of you is to set this context of why reasonable accommodations are often needed, what mental health struggles look like on our campuses, and whether we are a 4-year, 2-year, or a technical school, it doesn't really matter, and how we can reframe this group of students as one that we want to include and support. I'm going to briefly touch upon the Americans with Disabilities Act to ensure that we're all operating from the same reference. And then I want to spend some time sharing some of the accommodations that our research and also our services has learned actually do work to support college students with serious mental health challenges. And then I want to end with raising some of the challenges I think we're all facing and providing reasonable accommodations to this group of students, and the compelling irony of what the ADA has created on our campuses that we've learned about through some very interesting qualitative research. And then I want to make sure that we leave time for questions and conversations as well. So I'm starting off with a picture. This is a lovely photo for those of you who haven't been to Boston. This is Boston on a nice spring evening. So I want to start with this very large context that mental health matters. And we've done a really good job in our country, in our society, and on our college campuses of sort of separating the mind out from academia. But mental health matters. And it's very much a human issue and a public health issue. If anyone is living with any kind of mental illness or substance use disorder, it impacts our capacity to function in the roles that we want, in the environments that we want to live in. So whether we're a student, a worker, a partner, a family member, mental health impacts our capacity, and mental illnesses impact our capacity to function in those roles and environments of our choosing. This is, as I said, and many of you know, an incredible public health issue. 20% of Americans experience some form of mental illness across the lifespan, most notably anxiety and depression. And of those people, about 4% live with what we call a serious mental illness. And serious mental illnesses are defined as those that really negatively impact functioning for more than 6 months at a time, that people really can't gain any traction in their roles and environments for a protracted period of time. Adults with serious mental illness and co-occurring substance use disorders, the rates are highest among people between the ages of 18 and 25. And that's our cohort of undergraduate and graduate students, 35% as of 2014. And there's lots of reasons for this, but this is, it sets the context of why our mental health matters. And we all have mental health, and we all have mental health to lose. And the thing about mental illnesses is that they do not discriminate. There are certain things that can set someone up to be more vulnerable, but mental health happens to all of us, no matter our race, ethnicity, gender, economic status. It is very much a human issue. So college is a critical time of young adult development. And it's also a time when many serious mental health conditions emerge in people's lives. It's very common that if people are going to develop something like a bipolar disorder or some sort of mood disorder or a schizophrenia disorder, that it happens at this critical time of transition from living at home to moving away and going to college, or just becoming a young adult. And recently, young adult development, as you're probably very aware of and you're talking about on your campuses, we're describing it as being very delayed for this current group of students. And with mental health conditions on the rise in this current group of students for all sorts of reasons. These are students who've grown up on social media. Parenting practices have shifted in response to sort of this overarching culture of anxiety and what we're calling workism, going to college to get a high-paying job at all costs. And the general anxiety of our times has really led to these increasing numbers of students who are struggling on our campuses. We also are seeing that students are being identified earlier in secondary ed and elementary ed, and with IEPs and all sorts of emerging supports at lower levels of education. Students are arriving on our campuses already living with some significant mental health conditions. And colleges and universities have this mission to educate and prepare young adults to thrive as citizens, contributors, and workers in all sectors of our society. And so their academic goals are just one part of our students' personhood and well-being. And this is particularly true for higher education. Even on community colleges, I do a lot of suicide prevention work with community colleges, and they are now serving as kind of a one-stop shopping life experience for many students. Students are going there for not just their educational goals. They're going there for resources and supports. So it's not just our residential colleges that are dealing with the whole person, but our community colleges are, and our technical schools are dealing with the whole person. And there is this, you're going to hear from Sarah Lipson soon, and she's part of this research, but there is significant research that indicates that positive mental health is strongly correlated to academic success. So there is no academic success without positive mental health. It's also correlated to retention of our students, and ultimately it's correlated to vocational success and adult resiliency once they leave our campuses. So there's a real compelling argument to make the investment in the mental health of our students for not just the moral reasons of helping students really thrive, but also sort of the business side of our institutions, because the reality is our institutions are businesses. And they care about retention, they care about graduation rates, they care about things like diversity and inclusion. And I like to make the argument that this is a group of students that create important diversity and that we have an obligation to ensure their inclusion. And ultimately, at the end of the day, when we can support students in their mental health and they can graduate and go on to become contributing citizens in their communities of choice, they're going to return and look back on their higher education experiences as positive. And that has implications for alumni and development. And so there's a real compelling argument on many levels to support students who are struggling with mental health conditions on our campuses. So what you have in front of you is some information that probably Sarah might share some parts in a couple of weeks, but it's the prevalence of mental health problems and treatment utilization across U.S. college and universities. And this is from the Healthy Minds study. And if you look at the percentages of depression and anxiety and some of the suicidal ideation, non-suicidal self-injury, and then any type of mental health problem, I mean, these are really compelling statistics. We're talking about a third of our students in higher ed are struggling with some sort of serious mental health issue that interferes with their functioning, okay? And a third of them are in treatment, but treatment is not sufficient, right? And this is where we come in terms of what we can do on our campuses to support students. We like to say that a pill doesn't get someone a job. A pill doesn't help someone make a friendship. People need skills and supports, right, in order to be successful when they're living with any kind of health condition that interferes with functioning. Okay, medication is never sufficient, or treatment alone. A very, a key point too about some of the mental health problems that are on our campuses is we're seeing students who have significant PTSD. We're seeing students who have grown up under adverse childhood experiences, chronic poverty, chronic hunger, living with parents who have mental health and substance use problems. We see a lot of mood disorders, bipolar illnesses. We're now seeing more and more students, because of good treatment, who are living with schizophrenia disorders. And we're seeing larger and growing numbers of students who are on the autism spectrum on our campuses. And they bring all of that with them. They get in academically, but their personhood and the way they live their lives with this illness comes to campus every day. I think a key point about all of these mental health conditions is that they're incredibly variable, and they do not impact one person the same way. So I can have a bipolar illness and have it express itself in the way I live my life very differently than Russell or someone else. So there's no cookie cutter response from an academic or social or residential or treatment or even a legal perspective. It requires that we meet students where they're at, right? Face-to-face, one-on-one, individually responsive to who they are as a human being, and then how this particular condition plays out in their academic life, social life, emotional life. Another key point around higher education, I think, is that many of you probably know this, is that mental health conditions are incredibly responsive to stress and lack of wellness routines. And these are both inherent in post-secondary education. So things like sleep and exercise and good food and structure are really helpful strategies for students who live with serious mental health conditions. And those often get blown up when kids go off to residential campuses, or they go to community college and they're working and they're going to school, and reestablishing those routines to provide support for students become important ways that we can help them. But it is important to know, one, that these are incredibly variable conditions and that they're highly responsive to the stressors that are inherent in going on to higher education. So what we've learned about mental health struggles and functioning in college over, the last 25 years is that there's this potent intersection between one's mental health conditioning and functioning in higher ed. So obviously, students experience academic difficulties that are related both to their emotional expression of their condition and the executive functioning consequences that often come with living with a mental health condition. So it's both, feeling overwhelmed, feeling, having real highs, real lows, extreme anxiety that then intersect with academic demands. And then also things like concentration and attention to detail and planning and organizational skills that can be impacted by the illness itself. In addition, if students are then engaging in treatment for these conditions, the actual medications that students are prescribed often also impact their executive functioning. So they may be given medications that make it difficult to string a thought together in a sequence, to get out of bed on time, to have a clear head early in the morning. So medication, the benefit of treatment often has negative consequences in terms of academic demands on our students. Students who live with mental health conditions have difficulty sustaining concentration and stamina. There's a lot of energy that goes into managing a very significant health condition and then all of the social and academic demands that come with higher education. And again, I want to put in a plug for those of you who might be at community colleges where many of the students are also working on top of that. So they're spinning a lot of plates. They're not just going to classes, right? They're managing a health condition. They're trying to fit in. They're meeting all the academic demands of their particular course of study, and they may be working, and some of them may be parenting and living in families where they have demands placed on them as well. Another potent intersection is around the social and interpersonal difficulties that can come with a serious mental health condition. Students express a lot of loneliness and isolation. There's a tendency to withdraw, and not having that social support can be a real barrier to success for students on any of our campuses. They can have the variation in their moods can make it difficult to develop and sustain friendships that are going to be supportive and bi-directional, and that can also lead to further loneliness and isolation. Students can be very hypersensitive to environmental stimuli, noises. Here at Boston University, where all the first-year students live, there is a large, gigantic jumbo screen that sometimes stays on all night long. And this bright green light shines into 1,800 bedrooms of first-year students who can't sleep. So that hypersensitivity to all of the things that change when they're living on campus, being around other people who do things differently. Some of our students come to higher education having had a very regulated and regimented life where everything is the same. And then it all switches up when they get to our campuses, and people's mental health conditions can make them very sensitive to that. Inability to tolerate emotions and regulate emotions, and also I think of particular importance is being able to tolerate frustration. If they come from families that were resourced enough where they really were supportive around those types of issues, they get to college and they lack those skills. Right? They lack the skills of emotional regulation, tolerating frustration, being able to talk about their feelings and the reason for their feelings. That can lead to a lot of difficulties that get in the way of their academic success. Definitely difficulty responding to change and negative feedback. Right? And this is something I think we see across the board with a lot of students, not just students with serious mental health conditions. Many students haven't really had a lot of negative feedback in their lives, and how they receive it and use it can be very difficult. If someone's self-esteem and self-confidence has really been shattered by their mental health condition, it's even more difficult. The capacity to handle the time pressures and doing multiple things at once. When you have difficulty concentrating, you're taking medications that affect your cognition, all of that with a mental health condition, that is a very potent intersection. And then, you know, it's important to talk about what happens when someone has been diagnosed with a serious mental health condition. The negative reality is that despite the sort of the conversation that stigma is better, it's less than, that really isn't what we're finding in the research. And what people are telling us is that bias and prejudice and discrimination towards students with mental health issues is alive and well. And when someone is diagnosed with something like a schizophrenia disorder or a bipolar illness, that can lead to a great amount of despair and hopelessness. Their goals feel unattainable. And no one grows up wanting to be labeled with a mental illness, right? That is something that is still, we like to say, it's not a casserole illness. It's not something that people share with one another, because there are real ramifications. People experience discrimination and prejudice in subtle and not so subtle ways in our society and on our campuses. That sort of hopelessness and despair can lead to suicide, and it is the second leading cause of death among college students, and it is a risk factor of every serious mental health condition. And it's so, as Russell said, you can see this is not just about the Office of Accessibility, the Office of Disability Services. This is an issue that impacts every aspect of our campuses. And if we even swim further upstream and talk about mental health and how to promote that as a way to prevent suicide and to promote success of our students who are living with these conditions. And as we know from the data, a third of our students are living with these sorts of conditions. So again, I just want to reiterate that college education can be an important passport to economic self-sufficiency. So, you know, the long-term benefits of our campuses embracing students with mental health conditions, there's a lot to be said for that. It is a protective factor that can insulate students who do live with serious mental health conditions from long-term unemployment, poverty, and dependence on our systems of care like SSI and SSDI. And this is an area of research that my center has spent 40 years conducting. Why is it that adults with serious mental illnesses are so underemployed, even with all these evidence-based practices that have been around for a long time? Many of them never finished college. And in today's world, that can be a real impediment to getting a job that provides enough wages to live independently. Or they never were given the supports to perhaps go on to a trade school where they could again have livable wages. So students with mental health conditions do represent a very diverse subgroup of students that bring really valuable, important contributions to our communities. So there's a real social justice piece to this for all of us as well. So I just want to talk a little bit more about the inherent bias that is on college campuses around mental health conditions. I mean, I hear it all the time. We hear it when people describe students coming in looking for an easy way out. They want reasonable accommodations because they're anxious and they're lazy, they're unmotivated. They want to be spoon-fed because that's what mom and dad did for them. And the real world isn't going to accommodate them this way, arriving late to class or having a note taker. And while for a few of our students, this might be where they are in their maturation process, but for many students who are living with a serious mental illness, okay, they've been diagnosed with one, they're not seeking to get a pass. They're seeking to gain support to be successful. And so we need to think about where our biases are in the way we greet, the way we listen, the way we respond in our programs, in our classrooms, in our departments, and at the university level. Because the real world is also required to accommodate adults so they can succeed in their homes and at work and in their communities. So this is a commitment that ensures the inclusion of all students, including those with serious mental health conditions. These are invisible disabilities, and we do have an unconscious bias towards them in our society. We do believe that people who live with anxiety just need to kind of, get it together, pull themselves together. And living with these sorts of mental health conditions, if you don't live with one, then you don't really know how disabling it is. And we need to really listen with empathy and try to put ourselves in our students' shoes, because then that allows us to do creative brainstorming with them and with our faculty to really support them in their education. So I know you're all familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act that was, it's monumental legislation in 1990 and then was revised in 2008. And so this requires both public and private colleges and universities to provide equal access. That's the key word, equal access to post-secondary education. Title II covers our publicly funded universities, our community colleges and folk schools. Title III covers all of our privately funded schools, and all schools that receive any kind of federal funding are required under Section 504 of the Rehab Act, again, to create access to students with disabilities. In 2008, this was amended, and the significant change was really around the definition of disability. And disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that, quote unquote, substantially limits one or more major life activities, and that the person has a record of such impairment. And I think what's important to talk about, a great framework or in terms of this act, is to think about rights and responsibilities, because it is different from secondary ed to higher ed. So students with mental health conditions have a right to access, which allows them the opportunity to meet the demands of the university, the program, and the degree, and then also participate equally in our social and residential experiences that we might offer on our campuses. Okay, so students have rights and they have responsibilities. Again, one size does not fit all. So the individual needs of a student with a mental health condition are going to vary person to person. But this idea of rights and responsibilities reflects important values of partnership and respect. Okay, the student who's living with a mental health condition is the expert in that condition. We may have some expertise and knowledge in what sorts of accommodations are reasonable and can be provided, but they have the expertise of that experience. So listening for that. Again, as we all know, accommodations must be reasonable. Accommodations and modifications of policies and practices are not required when it would, and this is key, fundamentally alter the nature of the service, the program, or activity, or give rise to undue financial or administrative burden. Okay, again, another key phrase, this idea of burden on our faculty or administration or university to support a student. So the emphasis for us is on access, not outcome. The emphasis for the student is on outcome. That's their responsibility. We support and we provide key support so that they have access. Their responsibility is to make good on those opportunities. So that can be a very helpful framework in terms of thinking about college students who live with serious mental health conditions. So this is a list of academic accommodations that we know from practice and from research can be very helpful to students with serious mental health conditions. And it is by no means exhaustive, and it includes both traditional ones and some more creative responses to students with mental health conditions that can really positively impact their academic functioning. As you glance and look at this list, I think you'll see that most of them are relatively inexpensive, extremely low burden, and quite reasonable. Okay? So classroom strategies. A big strategy for many students who live with serious mental health conditions is having preferential seating. This is particularly true for students with anxiety and who have are living with PTSD. The capacity to leave the classroom when they need to and not have to walk in front of large numbers of students. This can be the difference between going to class and not for many students. Knowing that they have an exit strategy, it can totally minimize their anxiety about getting to class. Having an assigned peer classmate or mentor. We're doing actually a research project right now with peer mentors who are helping students in classes and with classes, and it's been really incredibly welcomed and well received by students. Pre-arranging with a professor for frequent breaks during the class, being able to get up and go out and practice whatever wellness strategy they might need in order to be able to have the stamina to stay, particularly in long classes or labs. It's interesting around this whole issue around attendance and staying in the class. It's something that I feel has migrated from secondary ed to higher ed. And I sound like an old woman when I talk about it, but when I went to college, if I didn't go to class, that was on me, right? I wouldn't do as well. There were never any grades for attending, and it was never an issue. Now students are graded often on their attendance. And this can create a lot of anxiety for people who live with serious anxiety, who might not be able to always get to every class. So this idea of prearranged or breaks or having preferential seating, these sorts of accommodations can be really helpful. Note takers, audio tapes of lectures, those are very common and long-standing accommodations that can be very, very helpful for students with mental health conditions, particularly if they're struggling with concentration, with being able to track notes, being able to listen to learn versus listen to take notes. Asking and getting private feedback on academic performance, particularly for some of the majors where feedback is given in front of the group, that can create large anxiety. Students will avoid going to those classes, which then can lead to more academic difficulties. Advance warning. This is a great one of class activities for pre-processing and preparation. Being able to sit down with a professor and hear about activities that might be triggering for students who live with trauma or who have huge anxiety, so that they can prepare and participate in a way that supports their well-being. Limiting or changing demand responses in class. This is one that's used a lot in law school programs and graduate programs, in clinical programs, where, again, even advance warning of this demand response that can put students on the spot, that can be very difficult for folks, and figuring out ways with professors and students to do that in a limited way or with preparation or less frequently can be very helpful. Allowing students to Zoom or Skype into classrooms and office hours. This can be helpful if students are hospitalized, they're out on a short-term break in order to take care of their health condition. Zoom as a platform, we're on it right now, does a lot to align with the ADA, and they have technology that's very accessible with people with disabilities. In fact, I was mentioning to Jessica and Russell that I worked with our Zoom person here at BU to make sure that my slides are accessible. So allowing for that if students can't come to class, rather than just assuming that then that class is off limits to them because they have a mental health condition. But you know, flexing that in and out as a strategy can be super helpful. Again, parking near classrooms, priority enrollment for classes, assistive technology. For things like assignment exams, alternative formats. Sometimes test anxiety of people who live with, you know, serious anxiety disorders where they will have panic disorders over final exams or oral exams. Sitting down and figuring out, is there an alternative format for this exam that allows the student to express and demonstrate their skill and their knowledge without it being an undue burden on the department? I mean, this is used a lot and successfully. Assisted computer software, obviously extended time on exams and assignments. But another one that students find to be really helpful is this idea of broken time, you know, where they can work for a period of time, then they're allowed to take a short break, leave the room during an exam. And this is done to increase concentration, right? And putting in place whatever it is that is going to make everyone feel comfortable that someone isn't cheating during this process. That's not the goal of broken time. The goal of broken time is to finish the exam with the sustained concentration that they need. Individually proctored exams, even in the hospital. Quiet, non-distracting rooms for an exam. Increased frequency of exams can be helpful for students. Advanced notice of assignments, that happens in syllabi, but not always. I hear about a lot of students being having the syllabi being changed at the last minute, and that can create a lot of problems for people who live with mental health conditions. And then written assignments rather than oral. So these sorts of academic accommodations have been designed to really level the playing field and give students access to their education and minimize what happens when they experience the expression of their mental illness. Okay? It is not to give them a leg up. It's not to increase burden on the faculty member. It's not to reduce the rigor or the demands of the requirements. It's meant really to create access. Some residential and social accommodations, obviously single rooms to ensure adequate sleep and a quiet room are really, really important. And this is an interesting one because what we're finding here at our university is that freshmen are coming to BU, and even before they arrive, they are not only asking, they're demanding that they have a single room, even students without disabilities. And so many of our universities who are residential and our colleges built their residential communities without a lot of single rooms. So this then becomes a very valuable resource. But again, as I mentioned, wellness routines for students with mental health conditions are incredibly supportive of their positive mental health. Sleep being a very, very important commodity for all students, but particularly when you live with a mental health condition. And a quiet room in order to be able to calm and soothe yourself if you live with voices or with, you know, rapidly cycling moods and anxiety. Service animals are a growing request. I'm sure you all have had experiences with these, but the use of a service animal to take to classes, to be in dorms, on spaces on campus, that has been individually trained to do the work or perform tasks for the benefit of the student is allowed under the ADA. The key thing is that the work or the task must be directly related to the effects of the student disability. So we've seen dogs who know when a student's about to have a seizure. We have dogs who remind students to take their medications. We have dogs who can sense the beginning of a panic attack and can work to help a student avoid that. So they can be very, very important supports and accommodations, reasonable accommodations for students living with mental health conditions. We've also heard more and more about engaging in online communities around campus as an extension of classroom projects. Students who So much of work these days in academic programs seems to be project-based. That can be very difficult for students who can't get out of their room because of their mental health condition and get to the project meeting, and being able to Zoom in and Skype in to these sorts of events can make or break a student's academic success. And offering that up as an idea. And then Zooming in or Skyping into campus events that are more socially oriented can be a modification that leads to eventual participation on campus, particularly for students who are struggling socially with social anxiety, who are afraid to go but want to go. This may be a way to take that small step towards that independence. So I want to take a few minutes just to ponder these challenges. There's been some really interesting research done in the last 10 years about why students who live with mental health conditions are not using the accommodations that they get. So students who have these invisible conditions, right? So they show up on campus and they want to prove to themselves that they can do college independently. And these are students who are coming to college off of an IEP, know that no one knows that they have this disability, they can't see it. I want to see if I can do it on my own. Students really worry that we are going to keep their condition confidential. And no matter what we say and how we reiterate that FERPA and HIPAA are moral and legal guideposts, they don't trust that. And they live in a world where information flows very freely. So we can understand why they mistrust. But that is a reason why they won't come and pick up those reasonable accommodations that may be waiting for them or use them. They also talk about feeling very ashamed to have to talk about their condition. Again, this speaks to the inherent bias and prejudice and discrimination that's out there about mental illnesses. And this is a big one. Many students talk about that receiving an academic accommodation means that they have to out themselves while delivering their disclosures to professors. And they feel these costs outweigh the benefits. And this has been called a double-edged sword around disclosing mental health conditions. Even though the condition is not listed or noted in the reasonable accommodation a certification or letter to a faculty member, the fact that students say they can't see it, they assume that professors will leap to the conclusion that I live with a mental illness. And they're not willing to do that. And this is a challenge for us to figure out how can we do a better job in engaging students who live with mental health conditions, and how can we tackle these very real barriers to helping students access their education. So it's really the irony of the American with Disabilities Act, this unintended effect that the very policy that makes access affordable also separates students. And disclosure is mandated by the ADA, of course, right? We can't accommodate them unless we know what their condition is and how it impacts their functioning. But it has the effect of producing an openly accepted form of alienation, marginalization, and discrimination. So some schools have tackled this by choosing to email reasonable accommodations directly to professors, and then it allows the students to have that buffer. And then when they do connect to the professor, they don't have to out themselves. It's already happened. They can just get to the business of dealing with the logistics of the accommodation. Some schools have gone to using portals for students to connect with note takers via email, rather than having the professor saying, I need a note taker for Susie Q sitting over here in the back of the room. And so thinking about how can we deal with these challenges so that our students with invisible disabilities, most of them being mental health conditions, will feel that the inherent bias in their peers and in the faculty and staff and in the policies and programs that may or may not be there, but they'll feel more willing to take advantage of the accessibility that is afforded to them as a result of their mental health condition. So I guess our challenges that I'll end with is, how do we assist students to see their identity, right? This is an identity issue as a student with a mental health condition as one that is valued on our campuses. That's a really important question for us. And how can we talk about it in a way as an identity issue, and it's an identity issue that we want to include and one that we want to value? How can we either limit or change our practices and policies that are unintentionally prejudicial towards mental health conditions, while at the same time empowering our students to embrace the responsibilities that come with higher education? And how do we create a culture of inclusion that it's embraced not only by the students, but by the faculty and the administration? So I think these are our challenges, some big ones that go beyond the day-to-day engaging and supporting and thinking creatively and partnering with our students who live with serious mental health conditions to succeed as students on our campuses. So I have a couple of resources here that I want to point out to you that I think are really, really great ones. If you are not familiar with the Bazelon organization, they have great resources around campus mental health. They do a lot of work in supporting students whose rights have been infringed upon by campuses. So if you are experiencing that on your campus with a student, this is a great resource. There are a lot of campuses that do flirt with the ADA, and so they've done a lot of good work in helping campuses shift in a way that is more supportive. The ACLU has a lot of resources around the myths and truths around the ADA for students with disabilities. This UMass Medical Center, the Transitions Center, they have a great tip sheets, accommodations for college students with mental health challenges that I highly recommend. And then at the University of Washington, Disabilities, Opportunities, Internet Working and Technology. This is a site that serves to increase the successful participation of students who have disabilities who are in the STEM programs on our campuses. So 4 great resources for those of you who are working directly with students with mental health conditions. So I'm going to stop there.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
And also, I want to make sure if people want to email me, my email is dorih, DORIH, @bu.edu. I'm happy to respond by email as well, also.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. We really appreciate it. And you can also obviously email us, Jessica or I, and we'll get information to you. Thank you again, Dorih. It was great to have you on here.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. And yay, spring is here. So yes. Enjoy the day.
Thank you, everyone.